Nothing is more heartbreaking as a parent than being up all night with a crying little kiddo who's sick and tugging at their ear, and you can tell they're just in pain and discomfort from an ear infection. And in fact, 80 to 90% of kids will have at least one ear infection by the age of 3. And a lot of those instances, kids have recurring or multiple ear infections that can sometimes lead to other interventions like tubes put in the ears and rounds and rounds and rounds of trips to the pediatrician, the emergency room, and rounds of antibiotics on top of that. And nobody wants their kid to be in this situation. And when you're a parent and you see, especially during this time of year when there's a lot of gunk going around, colds, head colds, that at the slightest bit of congestion or buildup of mucus that you notice in your kid, you're just hoping and praying that you don't end up in another round of antibiotics with your kid have another ear infection. So in this video, we want to talk about why kids get ear infections. See, most of the time we think of that and we're explained to us as parents from a health provider that an ear infection is an infection problem, and it is. An ear infection is an infection of the ear. This is my drawing. Um, be it what it is of an ear and an eardrum and that whole thing. We're going to talk about that diagram here in a second. But what happens when you have an ear infection? It's an infection of the eardrum, the ear, the eustachian tube that is in behind the eardrum. And most of us think of that as, oh, it's an infection. We need to treat that infection with a antibiotic. And that's the most common course of treatment for an ear infection is, oh, here's an antibiotic. Let's prescribe an antibiotic. Well, the one aspect to that is if it is an infection, you don't know, and unless you test, and I don't even know how they would do that, but the point is that you don't know what type of infection it is, whether it be bacterial or viral in nature, by looking at it. So if it is in fact a bacterial infection that's causing the ear infection, an antibiotic may prove to work in that case because an antibiotic is designed to kill bacteria. However, at least 50% of the time, I believe it could be a coin flip, but the statistics could show that it could be even more likely to be viral in nature than bacterial. An antibiotic is not going to do anything to improve the ear infection if it is a virus that's causing that infection. So to give an antibiotic without knowing for sure that there is a bacterial infection can have some secondary consequences later on in life with taking round and round, especially multiple rounds of antibiotics. And that's a conversation for a different video. But the point is that we think of these ear infections as an infection problem when in reality, it's a drainage problem. Okay? It is a plumbing issue. It is an ear, nose, throat, sinus plumbing issue where you have a buildup of fluid in the ear canal, and that fluid is not draining, so it just sits there. Anytime you have fluid that just sits in anywhere, think of it like a swimming pool. If you had a swimming pool that did not have a pump to circulate the water, and that water just sat there and it's stagnant, it's going to get gunky, right? It's going to get, algae and all this gunk build up on the water because it's just stagnant water. It's just sitting there. So you could go in and you could dump a bunch of chlorine in that swimming pool, and that might clear up that gunk for a little while. But if you don't get the fluid moving with a pump to circulate the water, then that can oftentimes gunk up again. So then you dump more chlorine in, and then it clears up, and then it gunks up again. And the same thing can happen with ear issues, ear infections, is if there is a drainage issue and fluid just sits in the eustachian tube, it cannot drain and it just becomes an easy place for a virus or a bacteria to sit there and proliferate and become infected. So when we break down the mechanics of how the ear works, it looks something like this. So obviously we have our ear. This is the ear. And then we have the little canal that goes into the eardrum. We all know what the eardrum is. The eardrum is a little membrane that covers the entrance to the eustachian tube. Okay, the eustachian tube is the area where if you get multiple ear infections, oftentimes then it leads you to an ear, nose, and throat specialist, and they give you tubes. So when they do that process, they're basically shoving a plastic tube in the eustachian tube to force it to stay open. Okay, because the reason for the infection is because it's closed. And the reason why that eustachian tube would close or close up and not drain is because of this little muscle right here. This is called the tensor veli palatini muscle. And it is just a tiny little muscle that actually goes around the circumference of the eustachian tube. Now, this muscle, just like any other muscle in your body, is controlled by a nerve. All right. And in particular, that C1, C2, C1 especially nerve controls this little muscle. So if there's an imbalance to the upper cervical spine, that C1 nerve, that can cause this muscle to spasm. And when that happens, that causes the eustachian tube to close up, and now fluid that is sitting in that tube can no longer drain. And it gets back to that story that we just described a minute or two ago, where that fluid cannot drain, so it becomes an easy place for virus or bacteria to come to proliferate and become infected. So when you look at this whole ear, nose, throat, and then you got the sinuses, the tube goes into the sinuses. So oftentimes we'll even see in a kid, especially if they've had multiple ear infections that has led to having tubes put in, then oftentimes that fluid doesn't just evaporate, it has to go somewhere else. So when kids get tubes put in, assuming that those tubes actually stay put in the ears and they don't fall out, then that fluid, that drainage issue has to go somewhere. So the next step is into the sinuses. So oftentimes we'll see when kids had chronic ear issues and then they get tubes put in, their ear infections go away, but now they got sinus, tonsillitis, nose and throat issues. So, chronic sinus congestion, sinus issues, sinus infections, strep throat, tonsillitis, all those different things, swollen tonsils, because that fluid just moved from, instead of getting stuck here and not draining in the eustachian tube, it moves down a level into the sinus cavity or into the tonsils, right? So it's an ear, nose, throat. It's just one big drain pipe. So chiropractically speaking, when we see and we get great results with kids that have ear infections, it's not because we're treating ear infections. It's because we are removing the stress and irritation on the nerves in the upper neck specifically, that relaxes that tensor veli palatini muscle that now allows that fluid to drain out of the tubes. I just had a little girl, her family have been patients for a long time, and their granddaughter was visiting just over the weekend, and her granddaughter was tugging at her ear, had an ear infection, and they brought her in, and we adjusted her a couple times over the weekend, and just in those couple days, she didn't do an antibiotic, she didn't do anything. Just in a couple days, that fluid started draining out of her nose. She started getting a little runny nose. That fluid started draining, and I actually looked into into her ear with a otoscope before she left to go back to where they live, and that fluid has started to drain, and that ear infection was well on its way to healing and improving without an antibiotic. And that's just simply because we opened up that drain pipe, right? We improved the plumbing in the ear, nose, and throat. So, and that's kind of funny because her grandpa, or he's not that old, he's a young grandpa in my opinion. He's actually a plumber. So if they're watching this video, he might find that interesting, because it's a plumbing issue only with the ear, nose, and throat. So if you're watching this video and you know somebody that's been struggling with issues with ear infections, with drainage issues, please forward them this video and reach out to us if you have any additional questions on how we can help, because we've helped many kids with ear infections. It's a pretty routine thing that we see here in our office, and we'd love to help you or one of your kids if you know somebody that's struggling as well. So thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you next time.